My guest this morning is a professor in the Department of Politics at the University of Johannesburg. His new book, Prisoners of the Past, South African Democracy and the Legacy of Minority Rule, was published by Wits University Press, and a copy of this book can be accessed on the link that I'm going to paste right in the description panel of this video and on our Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook pages. Professor Steven, welcome.
Thank you.
I'm very much happy to have you here. I read your book about a couple of weeks ago, and I thought it was very interesting. South Africa provides a very unique and interesting case study in as much as issues of politics and race relations are concerned. Your book begins with a paragraph that reads that in one of those polarized arguments, which are typical of South African political debate, a quarter century of democracy has either changed everything or nothing. Both views are right and both wrong. In light of this quotation, Professor Steven, what would you consider to be the central argument of Prisoners of the Past and the core ideas of the book?
The central argument is trying to challenge two explanations, as that first paragraph that you've read indicates, two explanations of why South Africa is as it is today. The first explanation is the one which says that nothing changed in 1994, which is very popular in sections of the society at the moment, particularly among young politicized people. And in this view, what happened in 1994 was when the system of white domination officially ended, was that the white power holders simply found a new way of entrenching their power. They did this through a constitution which constrained what a majority government could do. And as a result, they ensured that nothing really has changed in the last 27 years. And I challenge that argument in two chapters in the book. The one in which I engage with the work of Mahmood Mamdani, the scholar originally based in Uganda, who wrote a book called Citizen and Subject on post-colonial Africa, which has a very important section in South Africa on it. And I also engage with a number of South African scholars who say that the Constitution is the problem, that change has been halted or at least limited by the Constitution. The second argument goes something like this, that in 1994, South Africa managed to put its past behind it, a past of white domination of the Black majority, that it introduced a fine democratic constitution, that it was blessed with a leader in Nelson Mandela, who was revered around the world, and that this should have set the country on the path to prosperity and all the good things that go with it. Unfortunately, according to this view, a group of politicians in 2008, really at the end of 2007, got hold of the leadership of the governing party. Jacob Zuma became president of South Africa and destroyed all the good work that had been done up until then. And I also challenge this argument in much of the rest of the book. As far as the argument that nothing has changed is concerned, I mean, you know, as you say, it's at the beginning they're both right and they're both wrong. It's right in the fact that, as you will hear in a moment, many of the patterns of the past remain with us. But it's certainly wrong to say that South Africa today is the same as South Africa in the year 1994. So there have been significant changes, but the problem is that the patterns of the past remain the same. The second view is partially right in the sense that it says that there has been significant change. On the other hand, it fundamentally misunderstands what happened in 1994. Because in 1994, South Africa solved one problem. Now, it was a very important problem. And if it had not solved that problem, it couldn't have addressed any of the other problems. And that problem, of course, was the fact that 90% of the population did not enjoy basic citizenship rights, the right to vote, and the freedoms that go with it. But if you only change the political rules and you don't change the other aspects of the society, then what you find is that the patterns of the past repeat themselves. And that's what's happened in South Africa. Mm-hmm. And the way in which I kind of, you know, the metaphor I use is imagine that South Africa in 1994, not imagine, but understand South Africa in 1994 as a country which was run by an exclusive club. And in order to be a member of that club, you had to be white. What has happened in the last 27 years is that the club has opened its membership. So people who are Black are now entitled to be members, but it remains an exclusive club. It remains an exclusive club because about 2/3 of the population remain outside that club. And the club itself has rules which ensure that the older members have more rights and privileges than the newer members. So in other words, the old white establishment has more rights and powers than the new Black entrants into this exclusive club. And we see this in all facets of South African life. So it's in that sense that both are right and both are wrong. But the central argument of the book, therefore, is that South Africa has changed since 1994, but that the fundamental patterns have been maintained. The most important pattern which has been maintained is the division of the country into insiders and outsiders, because 2/3, or I calculate roughly 2/3 of the population are outsiders. And an outsider, in my definition, is somebody who does not derive any income from the formal economy. So if you don't earn a wage or a salary or dividends from a company, then you are an outsider. And if you include family members and dependents, etc., that's about 2/3 of the population. And that's the main thing we've inherited, but we've also inherited a lot else. We've inherited ways of thinking about things and ways of doing things, which were dominant in 1994. Mm-hmm. And in a nutshell, the reason for that is that what South Africa has done since 1994 is in effect try to squeeze as many Black people as possible into the old arrangement, rather than creating a totally new arrangement. So, you know, in the economic field, there's not that much talk of creating, well, there's talk, but there's not much action in terms of policy and so on. Not much interest in creating new businesses owned by Black people and supporting those businesses. It's far more a case of how many Black people can be accommodated in the management structures and the board of companies which are still the old companies which operated during apartheid.
So can you explain the meaning of the concept of path dependence and its applicability to the context of South Africa? You argue in the book that the economic and social developments of post-apartheid South Africa had their roots in the pre-1994 realities of minority rule, a system that for 30 years, the ANC has been unable to tear down. What key policies, practices, legislation, or events about apartheid left intact a deeply unequal economic system that continues to exclude millions of Black South Africans today?
What has been preserved are many of the patterns which underpin minority rule. So in many ways, what South Africa, if you know your South African history, South Africa is a key case of past dependence, because not only is South Africa repeating many of the patterns of the past, but they're repeating the patterns from an earlier past. I mean, in a nutshell, South Africa was established as a political unit by whites in 1910, at which stage the British were the colonial power. Later on, white Afrikaans speakers became the dominant group in government and declared a republic and introduced apartheid. And in effect, the kind of patterns which are dominating South Africa are not the patterns of apartheid, but the patterns of that earlier British colonialism, if you like. So we're following that colonial path. Path dependence, which is the concept I use in the book to explain this, is an idea which was popularized by the American economic historian Douglas North, and fleshed out by some of North's academic collaborators. And I do have a theory chapter in the book where I engage with North's work, and I'm very critical of aspects of North's work, but I still think that his idea of path dependence is relevant to my argument about South Africa. And essentially the argument is that if you change the political rules of a society, you cannot assume that you change the other fundamentals of the society. You don't necessarily change how the economy operates. You don't necessarily change how the cultural institutions operate or the educational institutions operate. And one of North's collaborators has argued that there are three dimensions of this. So in other words, if you simply change the political rules, the other three elements which need to be changed if you're going to have a really new society are the kind of values, what is valued and what isn't, and that is politically and socially. Patterns of behavior, in fact, what is considered an acceptable pattern of behavior and what isn't, and relationships between social actors, between government and business, etc. And it's these three fundamentals which have not changed in South Africa. So, for example, if you take the question of what is valued and what is not, we have in South Africa and have had for many years now a heated debate about how to create millions and millions of formal sector jobs. This is an incredibly destructive debate in a sense, or fruitless debate, because those jobs are never created. And the reason those jobs are never created is that the jobs which are promised by all these institutions and parties are jobs which have been extinguished throughout the world. Mm-hmm. And you have to ask yourself, well, why are people, these formal sector jobs in large factories and glass and concrete buildings are becoming less and less of an economic factor now? Why are they desperately trying to revive them? Well, the answer is that that's what white people had under apartheid. That's what white people had under colonialism. And so the idea is very deeply rooted that what we're trying to do is what I call in the book white privilege for everybody. You take what whites enjoyed under apartheid and you say, well, everybody should enjoy that. But the problem with what whites enjoyed under apartheid is that the only reason they enjoyed it is that they used the law and force to exclude 90% of the population. So the resources were distributed among 10% of the population, and the other 90% had to take the crumbs. Well, you can't sustain that, the standard which that 10% enjoyed by using force against the 90% for everybody. And one of the symptoms of that is that you have this idea of you're going to create all these wonderful jobs which are going to make sure that everybody in South Africa, their working life looks like that of white people under apartheid. Secondly, as far as the patterns are concerned, what is valued? is not changing the institutions, but changing the personnel of the institutions, which is an important thing to do, but it doesn't address the concern. So until recently, the debate about universities, which were a very good example of that second point, because a very perceptive South African educationist, a man called James Mulder, when in the 1990s, when previously white-only universities opened to Black people, Mulder and the universities, the first thing they did was that they created these bridging programs and these orientation programs so that Black students could participate and find out what was expected of them. And Mulder made the point that the programs were supposed to get the Black students to change so that the university didn't have to change. So the idea was that you didn't say, well, this has been an institution which has been designed for 10% of the population, and if 100% of the population is going to have access to it, you need different ways of running the institution. You simply said, well, how are we going to teach these new entrants to be like us? And finally, the relationships the relationships are still fundamentally the relationships of the insiders who dictate what happens and what doesn't happen, and the exclusion of the outsiders. The other book I published last year was a book called One Virus, Two Countries, which was a much shorter book discussing South Africa's response to COVID-19. And the argument of that book, and it relates directly to that, is that South Africa did worst in Africa on COVID-19 because the entire response was tailored to 1/3 of the population and totally ignored the needs and possible contribution of 2/3 of the population. And so that's a practical example of what happens when you have that reality. But we have no political party in South Africa which speaks for the outsiders. We have no major organizations which speak for the outsiders. There are organizations which outsiders form, but they tend to be quite local organizations. And so political debate in South Africa is a debate between insiders. So all of this is a pretty extreme case of path dependence. Just one bit of detail you might want to add to that, which I inserted in the book, but it's based on a journal article I wrote a few years ago. I mean, one of the ironies of post-1994 South African politics is that, we have these leafy suburbs where middle-class and affluent people live, and these high density townships and shack settlements where the rest of the people live in the urban areas. And so the suburbs are populated after 1994. They're less white than they used to be, but they're still where white people live. But the suburbs are populated by people who reject the governing party, who vote for the opposition. And of course, although that's changing now as well, the townships and the shack settlements have tended to be home to people who vote for the governing party. Now, Politics 101 would tell you that that means that there have been wonderful improvements in the townships and shack settlements so that the governing party will serve its voters, and the suburbs have been left to their own devices. In fact, the opposite is true. People in suburbs still have far more access to decision makers than people in townships and shack settlements. And the reason for that is that they're middle class. They know how to press the buttons. They know how to play the insider game. And so we have the irony here that in a situation in which the ANC is supposed to be, or it's changed now electorally, but up until 2014, the ANC was this very strongly electorally dominant party, which won more than 60% of the vote. The ANC has absolutely no power in township, in suburbs in South Africa at all. I mean, it's not only that its candidates get a fraction of the vote, 7-8% of the vote in these suburban areas. And the only reason it gets 7-8% of the vote is many of the householders employ Black people to work in their homes, and some of those Black people actually live in servants' quarters in the homes, and therefore are entitled to vote in that area. And I would estimate that if all of those domestic workers were voting in another area, the ANC probably wouldn't get more than 1 or 2% in those suburbs. So, the suburbs are places in which the opposition, in which the agenda of white suburbanites dominates. And that's a direct, that's as path dependent as you can get. Because of course, under apartheid, the suburbs were looked after very well by white government, and the townships where Black people left were actually deliberately underdeveloped.
So now, what would you consider to be the three main fudged compromises of 1994 settlement?
I mean, to me, the problem with the 1994 settlement was not fudged compromises. It was the limited nature of the compromises. So in other words, we negotiated a new political system with a new constitution, and it is a new political system, and the constitution is very different. Obviously, there's some things in the constitution which are fudged, and that's got nothing to do with past dependence, but may be particularly relevant in 2 years' time, because nobody, my imagination is, what I'm imagining is nobody imagined when they drew up the South African Constitution a situation which is very foreign to South African politics, in which no party could form a government because no party had an absolute majority. And so the Constitution is entirely silent on that issue. And, the last local elections, the ANC went down to about 47% of the vote. So there is a significant chance that the 2024 election in South Africa will produce a result in which no government can be formed, and there will have to be lengthy coalition talks, etc. And the Constitution has nothing to say about this at all. So, there's a big question mark about that. But as far as the negotiation process itself, this view that there were fudged compromises is a very common view. But in my view, my argument is that the compromise accurately reflected the balance of power at the time. And that besides that, the Constitution, see, the problem with the argument, the arguments I make about people who say, well, our problem is the Compromise of 1994 and the Constitution of 1994, is that when you question them, they can't really tell you what it is in the Constitution that prevents change. So you say to them, well, what clause is it in the Constitution which prevents a democratic government doing anything it needs to do to rectify the wrongs of the past? And the only example they can give, which is a very weak example, is that there's a property clause which protects the right to property. And of course, the argument is that white people gained their property by taking land away from Black people, and that there needs to be restitution. But if you look at the section of the Constitution where that appears, it also has another subclause, which says that none of this applies if you can demonstrate to a court that you're rectifying a historical racial injustice. So this argument falls away. If you want to expropriate land, or whatever the case may be, or redistribute land, and you get taken to court by a landowner, well, then you go to court and you say, it hasn't happened. But that's not the Constitution's fault. You go to court and you say, well, this is clearly righting a racial injustice. We need to do this. And then the argument sort of changes and says, let's say, well, no, it's not that the Constitution prevents anything. It's that the Constitution should actually have mandated change in a particular way. And I don't think that's a particularly democratic idea. You don't want the whole purpose of a constitution is to allow democratic politics to happen. You don't decide the outcome by saying, well, you must have the following policy. Whoever governs must have the following policies. Then you might as well not bother to have elections. So the constitution is not the problem. The problem is that what started to happen in the early 1990s, while the constitution was being negotiated, was that you had negotiation on other aspects of the society, which also needed to change. So you had negotiations on the economy, you had negotiations on education, on a variety of social sectors and spheres, etc. And the mistake the society made was that those negotiations, in effect, didn't get anywhere, because in 1994, the politicians and activists and business people, etc., who were part of this negotiation process said, well, now there's a democratic constitution and all South Africans are formally and legally equal. And therefore there's no further need for this. We can just carry on. And that's the mistake that needs to be rectified now, because as I explained when I talked about path dependence, you simply cannot assume that. You simply cannot assume that when the Constitution proclaims that all South Africans are equal, that means they really are equal, because that's something you have to make happen on its own. So the last chapter in the book deals with how, in a sense, we need to go back and complete the unfinished business of 1994, which is to supplement the political settlement with new sets of policies on the economy, culture, education, etc., which reflect the kind of compromises we saw on politics in 1994.
You argue that the most workable means of ending path dependency's negative consequences is negotiated compromise between the holders of power and those that seek it, those with a stake in the patterns of the past and those with an interest in ending them. What are your views on the idea of expropriation of land without compensation as a solution to the bigger problem of economic exclusion and inequality?
Well, look, I mean, if you want to know my opinion on expropriating land without compensation, I think there are cases in which that makes a lot of sense. But there is an entire chapter in the book devoted to the point that we've had a 3-year debate in this country over expropriation without compensation, which has been a phony debate in a sense, because the whole debate has been based on the idea that the Constitution forbids this. But the Constitution doesn't forbid it. If the current government had wanted to expropriate land without compensation, then it could have gone ahead. And as I said earlier, it could have, if it was challenged in court, it could have referred to that clause 25.8 and said, well, we were doing this in order to rectify the historical injustice. And if the courts say no, well, then you have to either change the Constitution or you have to change the composition of the courts. But we're nowhere near that yet. It's never been tested. Let me say that I think that property, despite the fact that you do need to override them for racial equality, property rights are important, and property rights are not only the rights of rich people. Property rights very often can protect the rights of poor people if you get other things right as well. But the argument for expropriation without compensation in South Africa is twofold, and they are both strong arguments. The one is that one of the realities we have in South Africa is that there's quite a bit of vacant land which has been bought for speculative purposes. So in other words, people buy this land and it simply lies there because they're hoping one day to make money out of it. I certainly think that land could be expropriated without compensation. The other problem is that in present arrangements, you do have the problem that when land is needed, the people who own that land very often, do not take reasonable bargaining positions. They do not try to compromise. And the prospect that in certain circumstances they might have to deal with expropriation without compensation may actually modify their bargaining positions. But I think one point which I would stress, which I think is one of the few issues of consensus on this issue in South Africa today, is that whichever way you go about it, it has to be constant. It has to be legalized. It has to be very clear to property owners what the law allows and what the law does not allow, because otherwise, you deter people. You deter property owners, and then that would be damaging to most people. But the most interesting point to me about the land debate is the extent to which it wasn't really about land, because the participants in the land debate were all these insiders. And I make the point very often that the one group of people in South Africa who was never asked their opinion on land expropriation without compensation is landless people, who are presumably the people who have most stake in that particular question.
Thank you so much, Professor Steven. I'm afraid we are running out of time, but thank you so much for your time, viewers and listeners. This was Professor Steven Friedman. He is with the Department of Politics at the University of Johannesburg. His new book, Prisoners of the Past, South African Democracy and the Legacy of Minority Rule, was published by Wits University Press, and a copy of it can be accessed on the link that I'm going to paste right in the description panel on the upload for this video and on our Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook pages. Professor Steven, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Wonderful. Thank you and have a good day.